How is it going, everybody? My name is DeMarco, and today I want to have a bit more of a serious conversation involving Starfield. Specifically, what could happen to both Starfield itself and Bethesda as a whole should this game not be as financially successful or as critically well received as many fans are either hoping or possibly even expecting that it possibly can be. I think this is a very important conversation to have because what I expect you'll find is that many people's response to this question would be possibly that Bethesda is dead, that the old Bethesda is dead, they can never recapture the glory of some of their older titles like Morrowind. Some people might even go as far to say that Bethesda will inevitably just get absorbed by Microsoft, never to be seen again. And I would argue that both of these statements couldn't be further from the truth. This video was actually inspired by a conversation point that Lone Vault Wanderer brought up in one of his recent videos, but like an episode of What If, I wanted to expand upon this and really dive into what we could possibly expect, again, from Starfield and Bethesda if this game should be a flop. Full disclaimer, I think that Bethesda very much will have one of the greatest games that they've ever released on their hands. I know that's a big claim, and if it comes true, is yet to be seen. We'll talk a bit more about that in detail. But again, this whole video is purely hypothetical, but I did want to bring up some interesting points, and I encourage you all to leave your thoughts down below, if for no other reason than to temper our expectations a bit, to manage our hype, to bring it back down to a reasonable level before we explode beyond anything that Bethesda could ever possibly achieve. So there's four main things that I think hold Starfield back, or could potentially hold Starfield back from accomplishing the highest level, the highest accolades that it possibly can. Of course, there's tons of moving parts here that would separate Starfield from being an okay game to a great game to the best game of all time, and contrarily to a complete flop. But these four, I think, encapsulate a more holistic view of what would stop Starfield from reaching its full potential. The first and foremost, something that's inevitable that you have to talk about, is bugs. Especially after the release of Fallout 76, fans are going to really be scrutinizing Starfield for the amount of bugs and problems that it has when the game does launch. A lot of the reason why there's a lot of pressure for Starfield to be as good as it needs to be is because they do need to recover from a lack of trust, from fans leaving their faith in Bethesda because of that game. The irony in all of this is, as games get larger and larger, bugs become more and more of a problem, and with Starfield posed to be one of the largest Bethesda releases of all time, you can see the irony. Number two is microtransactions, and admittedly, this is one that I think we have the least amount to worry about. I'm not worried about microtransactions. In fact, I don't expect there to be microtransactions, but I don't think it will be an issue. I do think it was worth bringing up. Number three is the way that Bethesda promotes the game. Bethesda, when they do take the show floor stage at E3, has a job to its fans in order to admittedly be completely honest with Starfield, what Starfield can and cannot do. To say that Starfield has 16 times the detail is something that's setting them up to get bitten in the butt, as it did with Fallout 76. Technically, Todd Howard wasn't lying about 16 times the detail when they revealed Fallout 76, but when you looked at the game and how it launched, and it admittedly is not graphically superior to that of Fallout 4, then you start to have fans raising questions and wondering exactly where that detail's coming in from. Comments like, "the greatest, most epic sci-fi game of all time," makes me nervous. That's a bold claim and something that can potentially come back to bite Bethesda. Now, Bethesda admittedly does a really good job in that they wait until the last possible moment, being E3, to show off the game, and then Starfield will release a couple months later. This means there's the least amount of things that can change. You're not going to get those massive bulleted lists of everything that Bethesda said would be in the game, but now actually isn't in the game. It allows us to go in with the right expectations, which brings me on to the fourth point, which is our own expectations of what the game can be. Starfield, as much as we want it to be the biggest, most epic science fiction thing of all time, which admittedly is what Todd Howard is claiming that Starfield can be, that doesn't mean the same thing to everybody, and it's important to at least mentally keep that in mind when we do finally see our first glimpse of gameplay at E3. You'll see various different conceptions and preconceived notions of what Starfield can and will likely be from the perspective of fans, even though technically that's just our interpretation. They've talked about how Starfield is going to be a Han Solo simulator, and a lot of fans have latched onto that, saying, well, if it's a Han Solo simulator but I'm not flying my own ship, then the game is trash. Or if there's not over a dozen planets in the game, then it's not good. Or they're trying to make comparisons to No Man's Sky or Star Citizen or any of these other titles, and that is dangerous. And admittedly, part of that does fall to Bethesda, where they do need to communicate with us exactly what this will be, which is going to come at E3. And after that, if you still have a warped perception of what Starfield is, that's on you. The moral of the story, hype is dangerous. We saw that with Cyberpunk. The same thing can happen with Starfield. We need to keep our own hype in check. We're responsible for that, not Bethesda, all the time. It's 50-50. Now, of course, there's a number of other factors that can come into play that can ruin Starfield, right? Those are kind of the holistic ones that I've picked out, but then you do, of course, have, well, if the music sucks and the gameplay sucks and the questing is terrible and the factions are bad and the companions are boring, so many things that happen in-game that could potentially hamper the experience. That is something that plays a factor into all of this, but those are just sort of the broader concepts that I thought were worth mentioning. So what happens if, let's say, all of these come to fruition? If this game is just a massive flop, if Starfield does not perform both critically or commercially, what happens to Starfield? What happens to Bethesda? And the answer is not as hyperbolic as many of you might think it will be. It doesn't mean the death of Bethesda. It doesn't mean that Elder Scrolls 6 won't be an amazing title. It doesn't mean that Bethesda is suddenly going to cease to exist and is just going to be dissolved into Microsoft. When it comes to Starfield, will we see a potential sequel if the first game happens to flop? Probably would be put on ice. We would get our Fallout 5, we would get Elder Scrolls 6. By then, keep in mind, we're talking anywhere from about 6 to 8 years from now by the time we would see a sequel to Starfield, if it's still the same time that it takes to develop games from Bethesda. Then maybe by then we'll see a sequel potentially. The next big thing that I expect to hear conversations circling around is whether or not the old Bethesda is dead. Is it ever possible to have another game that's as great as Morrowind or as great as Oblivion? And yes, absolutely. We see those conversations taking place with BioWare, and while BioWare has certainly seen steps in the wrong direction, I don't think it's beyond the fact of BioWare coming back and making another great game. Of course, it will be a different game. However, in the case of Bethesda, can they go back to the days of Morrowind? Yeah, they can have another great game, but it might just be for a different audience. So we've talked about how Bethesda will be and how Starfield will be going forward, but the fans, and the reason why I saved this was because this is more the point that Lone Vault Wanderer made in his video discussion about the subject, was he told it from the perspective of the fans, and I think he raised a lot of really great points, meaning this can be, and reasonably so, right? I'm not faulting any gamers who are frustrated with Bethesda or felt that Bethesda did them wrong when Fallout 76 launched, right? I think all of those people are completely valid, but I understand that this game, from a fan's perspective, can very well be the game that says, all right, I will continue to go along with Bethesda games, or you know what, I'm not even interested in Elder Scrolls 6. This is the game that will determine, am I going to follow Bethesda from here on out? And again, if you want to hear a really well put, I will link Lone's video in the description. This is what he talks about most, and he did it very, very well. So why essentially do I think none of this will be true, right? Why has the last several minutes of discussion almost been completely irrelevant? Well, there are reasons that you've heard before, right? The fact that Bethesda has the opportunity to work on a brand new IP outside of Fallout and Elder Scrolls, right? Bethesda is now able to move on to an entirely different world, and I think especially with Fallout 4, you were able to see that some of the departures that they've made from their traditional style was an attempt to think to themselves, how can we do something different? We've been doing these two series for so long, how do we evolve past that? And making a game set in an entirely new universe with new rules and new lore and new backgrounds and new technology is a great way to do that, if not one of the best ways to do that. So you do have this reinvigorated passion. On top of that, you do have the benefits of Microsoft and all the resources that are at their disposal as a result, whether it's the actual facilities or the staff and the skill sets and the members of the teams that have all different knowledge bases that can contribute to making Starfield run as optimally as possible. If they need to bring in QA testers and dozens of them to help polish Starfield, they can do that because they have all of these other teams that can lend a hand to make Starfield, especially when Phil Spencer himself is making claims that he wants Starfield to be the most played Bethesda game to date. That means it needs to do well. That means some of the issues we've talked about, like the bugs that can be solved, need to be solved. And so, on top of it being the main Maryland team, something I forgot to mention, Bethesda Austin did 76, the main core team that we know and love, that made the experiences that we love, is working on Starfield. And that, in and of itself, should be a breath of fresh air for a lot of fans who were hurt by Fallout 76. So let me know your thoughts. I thought this would be a bit more of a casual, low-key discussion. I hope that you guys enjoyed this different format from what I normally do, and maybe we'll do more of these. It's definitely easier for me to edit, which means I could theoretically get more discussions like this out. But thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I hope to see you all next time. So long, everybody.